I've got some troubling news about England's royal family.
Princess Anne did not raise her voice. She did something far more alarming. She pushed back her chair, stared across the private briefing table, and walked out before the final page had even been discussed. The reason was buried inside a confidential proposal linked directly to Meghan, a plan designed to pressure key political figures into changing the framework surrounding royal succession, eligibility, and the future position of Harry's children. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles knew the room had changed before the door closed. He watched his sister turn one page, then another, her expression tightening as a restricted dossier exposed outreach linked to legal reform advocates and Meghan. The dossier was a confidential collection of records, and this one contained meeting notes, draft arguments, names, and a handwritten warning that the succession structure had to be future-proofed. Anne felt something colder than anger. She felt betrayed. Family pain had crossed into constitutional pressure. Then she reached the title that made everything unmistakable: the Royal Succession Modernization Proposal, a plan intended to push Parliament toward changing succession laws so descendants of royals living outside Britain could receive stronger protected succession rights and face fewer future exclusion mechanisms. Parliament, the elected lawmaking body that helps determine legal rules affecting the crown, could not simply be ordered by the palace, and that was why the outreach frightened her. Charles quietly asked her to remain seated. She did not look back. The king repeated her name, but Anne kept walking, leaving him with silence instead of an argument. William reached for the dossier after she left. He expected Harry at the center, yet the language went further. The prince saw protections designed around Harry's descendants, creating a long-term shield that could shape future disputes after the current generation was gone. He read the handwritten note again. Future-proofed. One word, but it sounded like a warning. Meghan's name appeared beside strategic talking points and private meetings, and the future king realized this was not a family complaint waiting to cool. It was a structured effort with a political route, a legal goal, and consequences that could reach his own children. Anne's walkout terrified him because she never abandoned duty impulsively. If she had left, something inside that file had crossed a line she believed could not be uncrossed. William closed the folder, looked toward Charles, and decided he would find out why. But before William could challenge the plan itself, he had to understand the three people now trapped at the center of a battle none of them could escape. For Anne, succession was never a family trophy. For William, it had become a responsibility he had spent his entire life preparing to carry. And for Meghan, the old royal structure represented something different entirely. A system capable of deciding a child's place before that child could speak. Behind the legal language were three human beings carrying three very different wounds, and now those wounds were being forced into the same room. Anne stood alone beside the writing desk, removed her glasses, and placed them beside the dossier. The Princess Royal, a title traditionally given to the monarch's eldest daughter, treated duty as heavier than preference. She looked at the aide and said, "This is no longer about hurt feelings." The aide heard nothing. That made it worse. Anne believed succession, the legal order deciding who inherits the crown, could not become a bargaining tool whenever the family fractured. Her loyalty had cost her comfort before, and she would pay that price again. William felt a different fear. The prince knew his place in the line of succession shaped his life, but George, Charlotte, and Louis gave that burden a human face. He was not protecting himself. He was thinking about the stability his children would inherit, and whether private pressure could turn rules around them into weapons. When he reopened the file, Meghan's name appeared beside notes suggesting direct conversations with lawmakers instead of negotiations through the palace. Lawmakers were elected officials able to debate and change legislation, meaning the proposal had moved beyond a family appeal. William read the line twice, then called Charles. Charles answered quietly. The king feared stopping the initiative could push Harry further away, yet ignoring it could destroy William's trust when unity mattered most. He admitted as much, and the future king chose his words carefully. If we stay silent now, silence becomes permission. The monarch did not argue. He listened. Meghan received a private call from Harry. He asked whether the proposal had gone further than they had originally discussed. She said nothing at first. Then she told him she was thinking about their children's future, about Archie and Lilibet growing vulnerable to decisions made in distant rooms. Harry pressed again. Meghan's silence stretched long enough to become an answer. The crisis felt older than the dossier. Anne sensed it. William sensed it. Even Charles understood the plan had not begun with legal notes or political contacts. Weeks earlier, one conversation at a memorial reception had planted the fear that turned private concern into a secret campaign. And when the palace reconstructed that conversation, Anne finally understood that the plan had begun long before anyone thought to look for it. Every royal crisis has a moment that seems harmless, until history turns around and points directly back at it. This one began after a private memorial reception, when Meghan remained behind, following a tense conversation about the future status of children raised outside the working monarchy. What was said lasted less than 20 minutes. Yet one sentence spoken that evening became the trigger for everything Anne would later discover. Meghan had already been carrying the fear for weeks. Discussions around non-working royals, family members who retained royal connections but no longer performed official duties, had grown sharper, and she worried unwritten palace customs could shape how Archie and Lilibet were recognized years later. Those customs were informal practices rather than fixed laws, which made them feel even more dangerous to her. A future monarch could interpret them differently. A private decision could become a permanent wound. Then a senior constitutional advisor approached her after the reception. The advisor, whose role was to explain how royal practice interacted with law and government, spoke carefully until one sentence changed everything. Future sovereigns must retain discretion over family members who no longer serve the crown. Meghan froze. She asked whether that discretion could affect children. The answer came through a documented account, later reconstructed by the palace. Future circumstances could require future decisions. That was enough. She left convinced Archie and Lilibet might someday depend on the goodwill of a monarch instead of permanent protection. Harry found her alone after the reception. He sat beside her and asked what had happened. Meghan looked at him, still shaken, and said quietly, "I will not let their future depend on another private decision." He tried to calm her, reminding her that fear could make every uncertainty feel like a threat. She heard him, but the warning had already taken root. That same night, Meghan opened a notebook and wrote, "Legal protection, not palace reassurance." She circled the words twice. Then she contacted a former advisor through a recorded call and asked one question: what would it take to create lasting safeguards? The first draft remained narrow. It focused on clarity for royal descendants living outside Britain. Then the language expanded. Parliamentary review, the formal examination of proposed legal change by elected lawmakers, appeared beside broader succession protections and stronger safeguards against future exclusion. Anne later read the reconstructed conversation and understood why Meghan had been frightened. For one painful moment, she even felt sympathy. But sympathy did not survive what came next. Because sympathy ended the moment Anne and Meghan finally faced each other without advisors, lawyers, or distance between them. The meeting was not arranged as a reconciliation. Anne entered knowing exactly what she intended to ask, while Meghan arrived knowing the palace had already seen too much. No aides sat between them, no private secretaries interrupted. Then the Princess Royal placed the proposal on the table, pushed it forward with 2 fingers, and asked a question so direct that even Meghan hesitated before answering. "How far were you prepared to take this?" Anne had demanded the private meeting because she refused to argue through palace intermediaries. The Princess Royal, the monarch's eldest daughter carrying a senior ceremonial role, believed family fear had been turned into political pressure around a constitutional system larger than any one person. Meghan understood the anger, yet she had agreed to come because she believed Anne might understand one thing others had missed: the terror of watching children become symbols in a fight they never chose. Anne leaned forward and accused her of using private pain to push at the legal structure of the crown. Meghan did not flinch. She said Anne had never watched her own children's identities debated across countries, while wondering whether status could someday become punishment for decisions made by their parents. The words landed hard. Anne rose from her chair. "You protect children openly. You do not rewrite the crown in secret." Meghan remained seated, but her answer came instantly. "Openly was never an option you gave us." Silence followed. Then the Duchess admitted something more dangerous. She had personally approved contact with reform advocates, people pressing for changes in law, and she had supported early conversations about stronger protections. But she insisted Harry had never seen how far the final proposal had expanded. Parliamentary strategy, meaning a planned effort to influence elected lawmakers who could debate legal change, had been added after the first draft. Anne studied her face and asked whether Harry knew about the direct outreach. Meghan said no. The answer changed the room. Until that moment, Anne had treated the Sussexes as one force moving together. Now she realized Harry might not be the architect at all. That did not make Meghan's decision acceptable, but it cracked open a new and painful possibility. The family had been fighting the wrong shape of the threat. Anne took the dossier back, closed it firmly, and told Meghan the matter would now move beyond personal explanation. Charles held the crown. William represented the future monarchy. Parliament held legal boundaries no royal could simply command. Anne had delivered the warning, but now the real question was brutally simple. Who actually possessed the power to stop Meghan's plan? The greatest shock was not that Meghan had built a plan, it was that no single royal could simply erase it. Charles could defend the institution. William could shape the monarchy's future direction. Anne could expose the danger she believed the proposal represented. But succession law existed beyond private palace commands, and as the king sat with the briefing in front of him, he confronted a painful truth. Family authority and constitutional authority were not the same thing. Charles read Meghan's handwritten phrase about protecting children and set the page down. The king had been briefed that the palace could oppose the proposal, argue against it, and define its public position, but it could not privately rewrite legislation by command. Legislation meant laws debated and passed through the country's political process, and succession rules sat beyond a family order delivered behind closed doors. That mattered because the crisis had escaped the boundaries of Windsor. William watched his father's hands tremble. The prince said nothing at first, but he understood what the silence meant. Charles feared losing Harry completely. The monarch finally admitted it, saying another permanent rupture with his son might become impossible to repair. William answered with care, yet he did not soften the warning. Fear cannot become the basis for constitutional compromise. The future king had been advised that his strongest power was not legal control, but public direction. He could define what his future monarchy would support and refuse private bargaining over succession. Anne returned calmer, but colder. She looked at her brother and told him compassion for Harry could not become hesitation. Charles met her eyes, and she repeated the point more quietly. Love did not remove duty. Then palace advisors delivered the detail that changed the urgency. Several early contacts with reform advocates had occurred. Those advocates were people pressing lawmakers to consider legal change, which meant the proposal could no longer be buried inside a royal file and forgotten. William leaned forward. He proposed something no one in the room expected. Acknowledge the family fear behind the plan. Admit that uncertainty about children and status had created pain. Then publicly reject private lobbying tied to succession. Charles stared at him. Anne did too. The response would separate emotion from law, without pretending the emotion was false. For the first time, the king seemed ready to approve it. Then a message arrived. Harry had received the proposal. Not the early version, the final one. And he was reading it now. The palace had prepared for Meghan to fight back, but nobody was prepared for Harry to turn toward his wife and ask why he had not been told everything. Harry read the first pages quickly. Then he slowed down. By the final section, he was no longer reading like a prince studying a political proposal. He was reading like a husband, discovering how much had happened around him without his full knowledge. Meghan watched from across the room as he returned to one paragraph 3 times. Finally, he lowered the papers and asked the question she had feared from the beginning. When did this become bigger than our children? Harry had known she wanted stronger protection for Archie and Lilibet. He understood why uncertainty around their future hurt her. But the final strategic draft, a completed plan setting out legal goals and political action, went much further than the safeguards they had discussed. Broader protections appeared beside political outreach. The fight now carried his history, his children, and his name, yet he had never been given the whole map. Meghan tried to explain. She told him she believed he would hesitate because succession reopened every wound the institution had left in him. Harry stared at her. He had spent years arguing that others made decisions about his life without listening, and now a campaign conducted for his family had grown while he remained outside its final choices. Meghan said fear had driven her, not ambition. She described the advisor's warning again, and admitted the proposal had expanded beyond the purpose she first imagined. Harry folded the final page once and placed it on the table. "You cannot protect me by deciding what I am allowed to know." She lowered her voice and said she had been trying to protect their children from uncertainty. He answered that Archie and Lilibet deserved protection, but their names could not become permission for secrets between husband and wife. Then Harry reached for his phone. Meghan asked who he was calling. He said, "My father." Charles answered directly, and the Duke spoke through a recorded private call preserved in the crisis account. He told the king he would not support the expanded plan in its current form. Charles asked whether he understood what that decision might do to Meghan. Harry looked across the room at his wife and said he understood exactly what it could cost. Still, he would not defend a strategy he had never approved. The call changed Anne's understanding immediately. Harry was no longer simply one half of a united threat. He was a wounded son drawing his own line, and she agreed to meet him without officials present. For the first time since Anne stormed out, anger began to loosen its grip, because the next conversation would not be about law at all. It would be about family. There were no briefing folders between them this time, no constitutional advisors, no prepared statements. Anne sat opposite Harry as an aunt, not simply as the Princess Royal, and he faced her as the nephew who had spent years believing that every royal conversation eventually became an institutional judgment. For several moments neither spoke. Then Harry said something that stripped the crisis of all its legal language. "I am tired of my children inheriting my fear." Anne held his gaze. She had agreed to the meeting after learning that he had rejected the expanded proposal in its final form. Harry told her the concern had never been about moving Archie or Lilibet ahead of William's family. It was about preventing institutional retaliation, punishment delivered through structures because of choices made by parents. The Princess Royal listened without interrupting. Succession, the legal order deciding who inherits the crown, was one matter. Personal rejection was another. Anne admitted the monarchy had often failed to explain that difference, and silence had allowed fear to fill the empty space. Harry looked down. He confessed that his fear of losing more family had made him avoid conversations. He had waited, withdrawn, and assumed palace discussion would become judgment. Meghan had seen that hesitation and acted without trusting him to face the consequences beside her. The Duke did not excuse the secrecy. He admitted how his silence had helped create it. Anne reached across the table and closed the folder. "Then stop speaking through documents. Speak before the damage begins." Harry gave a nod. For once, the words did not sound like an order. They sounded like advice from the aunt sitting across from him. He then made his request. He would publicly distance himself from the expanded plan, but Charles and William had to create a transparent family framework, a guide explaining future status, expectations, and boundaries for relatives outside the working monarchy. Transparency mattered because uncertainty had allowed private fears to grow into political pressure. Anne truly understood the distinction. Clear rules would not alter succession law or move anyone closer to the throne. They would remove the shadows in which this crisis had grown. She agreed to carry the request back to the king and the future monarch. Harry thanked her, and she told him gratitude meant nothing unless he spoke sooner next time. Within hours, the palace began preparing its position. Meghan faced a decision of her own, and the dispute that had remained behind closed doors was breaking into public view. The private battle had finally changed direction, but outside the palace gates, Britain was about to turn Anne's walkout into the image of the day. By sunrise, a private family rupture had become a national argument. Broadcasters abandoned ordinary royal coverage. Constitutional experts were summoned before breakfast. Crowds slowed outside Windsor, staring at phones carrying the same explosive words: succession, Meghan, Anne, walkout. Yet one image captured the public mood better than every studio debate. The closed palace door Anne had walked through, now transformed into a symbol of a monarchy drawing a boundary. Meghan watched the coverage without speaking. Commentators called her a determined mother in one segment and a constitutional provocateur in the next, leaving her exhausted by two versions of herself that seemed to swallow every human reason behind the plan. Constitutional meant connected to the rules and institutions governing how the crown operates, and that was why the argument had moved far beyond family tension. The palace released a formal position rejecting private attempts to influence succession reform, while admitting clearer communication was needed for non-working royal relatives, meaning family members outside official royal duties. The statement mattered because silence had helped fear grow, yet surrendering to private pressure could make succession look negotiable. William read the morning coverage before joining Charles. The prince paused over Anne's photograph and told his father, "One walkout is now bigger than the meeting." The king understood. Public opinion had turned a private gesture into a national line in the sand. Then a major morning broadcaster opened with the words, "The Princess Royal walked out, and Britain walked into a constitutional argument." Outside Windsor, a crowd gathered holding newspapers beneath the front-page headline, "Anne draws the line." Harry moved next. Through a direct written statement released by his representatives, he rejected the expanded reform proposal and confirmed he supported transparent protections for family members without changing succession for personal disputes. The Duke's words cut through the noise because they separated his children's security from the legal order of the crown. Meghan read his statement twice. Then she contacted her former advisor through a recorded private call and withdrew her support for the final draft. She admitted the proposal had moved beyond protecting Archie and Lilibet and become something she had never first intended to build. The campaign began collapsing almost immediately. Anne received the news in silence. She did not celebrate. The Princess Royal simply returned to the room she had abandoned, knowing anger had forced honesty, but honesty now required a final decision. The country had chosen its headlines, Harry had chosen his position, and Meghan had withdrawn her plan. Now Anne returned to discover what her walkout had actually changed. Anne returned to the briefing room without ceremony. The same chair waited where she had pushed it back. The same table stood beneath the weight of a crisis that had nearly transformed private fear into a constitutional confrontation. But the proposal was no longer active. Harry had rejected its expanded form. Meghan had withdrawn her support. Charles and William had reached a decision. This time, when the Princess Royal sat down, nobody expected her to leave. Charles spoke first. The king confirmed that the palace would oppose any attempt to reshape succession law through private family lobbying or pressure. Succession law meant the legal rules deciding who could inherit the crown, and those rules would not become a bargaining tool in a family dispute. William supported a written family status framework, a guide explaining expectations and public standing for close royal relatives outside working roles. The prince believed clarity mattered. Charles lowered his voice. He admitted unclear communication had helped create the fear Meghan tried to answer through the wrong method. The monarch did not defend her campaign, but he refused to pretend palace silence had played no part. Anne looked at her brother and said, "Defending the crown did not require pretending the family had made no mistakes." He held her gaze, then thanked her for walking out when everyone else had remained frozen. William said nothing, but the future king had protected the structure he would inherit without denying the pain behind it. Charles placed the withdrawn proposal in a folder. Anne looked at the chair she had abandoned, sat firmly, and said, "Then we have finally separated fear from law." The decision was complete. Meghan's succession campaign ended. Harry rejected the expanded plan through his written statement. The palace moved forward with clearer guidance for relatives outside the working monarchy. But the legal line of succession remained untouched. Anne's walkout was not remembered as simple rage. It became the moment two uncomfortable truths were forced into the open. Meghan had crossed a constitutional boundary, and palace silence had helped create the fear behind her choice. Nobody received everything. Meghan lost the plan but forced clarity. Harry regained his voice. Charles accepted responsibility for hesitation. William protected the future he would inherit. Anne proved loyalty sometimes meant leaving the room so everyone inside understood what was at stake. Anne had stormed out, because the line between family fear and constitutional power had been crossed. She returned only after that line was restored, leaving the monarchy bruised, chastened, and finally certain of where it stood. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.